And vendor bills are expenses that are associated with the project and submitted as a bill from a vendor. Allowing users to create vendor bills in BigTime gives them a way to log third-party expenses and not have to rely on your accounting system to enter your vendor bills. So what we've done is included an additional option on the expense entry screen where any user who has the proper permissions can choose to enter a vendor bill, submit it alongside other expenses. So you can see I've got my site pulled up here, and before you can actually enter vendor bills, you have to enable this feature, so it will be off by default. To enable it, you can navigate to My Company, again in the dropdown, and this new active features section that we added. So here you can see it's on for me, but once again, it's off by default, so you do have to navigate to this menu to turn it on, at least initially. And then to actually enter those expenses, you do have to have the proper permissions enabled. So we did add user right to enable vendor expense entry. So for My Company user rights, I'll just use everyone as an example. There is a new permission for the ability to log vendor expenses. This allow user to log vendor expenses has to also be turned on in order to have the option to actually enter those expenses. Let's take a look at how you actually enter. So I'll navigate to time and expenses. And next to add expense on the right, you'll see this drop down. Now you have three options here. So you can add an expense, which is a standard expense, can mean employee. You have add charge, which is to add a credit card charge. And you have add vendor expense, which is the new feature. Let's click that. And now we can select our vendor, full vendor list from QuickBooks. Enter a reference number. Choose an expense type, and these are the same expense types that you have available for standard expenses as well. Find in My Company field values. Date, choose a client. Amount, log it to a task. Note, upload a receipt, and then choose to mark it as non-billable. You don't have the non-reimbursable option because these vendor expenses aren't tied to a staffer, so there's nothing to reimburse the employee for these vendor expenses. Then you can hit save. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that V next to Henry's Auto Shop. That signifies that that expense is a vendor expense. And when you are ready to submit, you can click submit at the bottom of the screen, just as you would with a standard expense. For our purposes, I'll submit just our vendor expense that we entered. So I'll check this box on the right. Check that vendor expense on the left. Hit submit expenses. So submission process is pretty much the same as you would for a standard expense. You can submit all expenses at once, or you can pick and choose individual vendor expenses. And those fields that show that this is a vendor expense, that V, that would also be displayed on reports as well. So you'd be able to run a report and see only vendor expenses, or just have a clear designation of what is a standard reimbursable expense versus your vendor expenses. Okay, so we've submitted our expense. Let's say we wanted to post this expense to QuickBooks. Navigate to QuickBooks, post expenses. And down below, now see this new message that states there's two vendor expenses totaling $120 within the date range. So that's what you have to click in order to post these vendor expenses over to QuickBooks. As you can see, these two vendor expenses up top don't have a checkbox next to them, so you wouldn't be able to check the box and post as you would with a standard expense, you have to click that link at the bottom of the screen. After you click that, you can pick and choose individual expenses to post over. You can also click the vendor name, open up the expense detail. So from here, you can edit that reference number, select the terms for the vendor bill. One note on terms, if you do have a default set of terms for a vendor set up in QuickBooks, those terms will apply once you post the vendor bill to QuickBooks. However, there's no way to set a default in BigTime, so just make sure that is set up in QuickBooks if you do want the default set of terms to apply to that customer. Then you can choose your vendor, which you already selected when you entered the expense. You can just change that from here. Use your accounts payable. I've already got that set up as my default accounts payable under my QuickBooks integration settings. Look at. Click into manage. Expense bills / AP all the way at the bottom. Got my only accounts payable, which is just called AP. That's coming from QuickBooks. You can choose where each of these expenses should go in terms of which expense account. You could change the quantity and rate, which would affect that total amount well. And then the blank items below are where you can start to enter a new expense. So if you wanted to add a new expense to this vendor bill without having to go back through the standard expense entry process, you can do that just by clicking into that separate line, entering the quantity and rate, and that'll post over as an additional expense on this vendor bill. Basically, that allows you to just bypass the standard expense entry and submission process and add an expense directly to this same expense report. Then once you hit post to QuickBooks, it will create that bill within QuickBooks.